With Street Fighter 6's release just months away now, Street Fighter 5 is seeing out its final days under the main spotlight. It's been a polarizing game that's caused many players to rage quit the franchise, at least temporarily, but it's also got a lot going for it. It's retained a relatively strong active player base, sold a respectable 7 million copies, and is likely the best balanced Street Fighter game to date. We recently saw a strong final SF5 Capcom Cup that was surprisingly able to hold the attention of the community for a consecutive 8 days, while producing interesting competitor storylines through the likes of Ending Walker, Zen, and the only 2-time Capcom Cup champion now, Mena RD. Street Fighter V has brought us to the edges of our seats during EVOs, Capcom Cups, and other major events like E-League and Street Fighter League, and we've seen some pretty awesome and inspiring player narratives play out over its time. It's safe to say that the game must be doing something right if it's been able to produce such intriguing moments and stories over its years, but if I'm being honest, I have to say that for all its wins and for the fact that it's got such a relatively good balance, it still isn't as fun as it could have been thanks to a particular thorn in its side. Now, if I were to try to categorize said thorn, I'd say it's an imbalance of risk versus reward that places the game just on the cusp of what fans expect from a Street Fighter entry. The balance of risk versus reward is a thread that permeates most every level of every competition. Too little risk and the reward loses its meaning, and thus we become bored with the whole process. Too much risk and the reward feels out of reach or impossibly difficult, and we become either hopeless or frustrated. A well-calibrated approach to risk and reward, however, produces an intriguing sense of potential satisfaction that gets us to come back to the process over and over again. I'll add here that I'm not talking about reward in terms of a prize pool for winning a tournament or getting recognition from your peers, but rather the sense of victory contained within the game, so winning a round, winning an interaction, or even scoring a single hit that you meant to hit. If these super common aspects are continually satisfying in their nature, well, it's safe to say that you have a satisfying game on your hands. But if and to the degree that they're not, they become a constant drag on the overall experience. Another key part of this puzzle is fan expectation. Street Fighter has been around for over 35 years now, and a certain formula for what Street Fighter is has naturally emerged. Capcom evolves this every time they bring out a new franchise entry, but deviate too far too quickly and fans won't recognize your game as Street Fighter anymore. A lot of the expectations for Street Fighter gameplay can be nicely arranged around a central concept called footsies. And we have a full video that goes much more in depth on the topic of footsies, which you're welcome to check out after you finish watching this one, but in short, it's basically the real-time testing of reaction and prediction explored as you and your opponent maneuver around and try to poke at each other. Note that the fireball versus jump versus uppercut duels that were especially common in Street Fighter II fit nicely into the reaction versus prediction dynamic here as well. Now, this differs from the likes of the high-flying and more chaotic titles like the Marvel vs. Capcom series or Dragon Ball FighterZ, where footsies definitely still exist, but may not be as critical as things like on-screen positioning and assist strategies. Also, in those games, touch of death combos that completely empty a character's health bar are common and accepted, but Street Fighter players have grown to expect their rounds to be determined by multiple successful hits, most of which are made through footsie play. Street Fighter III Third Strike widely set the bar here for its renowned footsie play, and while it has relatively terrible character balance by today's standards, universal parries give players a sense of defensive, skill-based autonomy that helps stave off those feelings of hopelessness I mentioned. Those who recall the Street Fighter IV era will remember how much of a backlash Capcom got for that game's option select fueled vortexes, which essentially made it so that once certain characters knocked you down, you likely weren't getting another chance to get up and hit them, as they'd be able to stay on you and knock you down repeatedly until your life bar was completely emptied. Okay, so where did Street Fighter V go wrong here? Well, let's look at the status of footsies when the game first launched. Here we find a combination of things that weren't necessarily bad on their own, but when brought together were something of a perfect storm that turned the risk and reward expectations on their head. 3 things out of the gate: a priority system where heavier attacks would beat weaker ones when clashing on the same frame, crush counters that gave massive bonuses to certain heavy attacks when they connected as counter hits, and then nearly 8 frames of fluctuating input lag, meaning that there was a delay between the time you pressed a button and when your character actually would manifest the corresponding action on the screen. Oh, and this last one, by the way, was indeed bad on its own. The first two basically buff using heavy attacks in fairly straightforward ways, but the third is where the risk and reward really got skewed. Input lag naturally nerfs reactions, and so reactive punishes could easily be too late, resulting in missed opportunities at best and full-on beatdowns at worst. Instead of using the 3 strengths of attacks, each of which is supposed to play their respective roles in the course of a footsie fight, the action quickly devolved into relatively mindless slugfest as the risks of the traditionally slower heavy attacks were mitigated while the rewards were vastly expanded. One of the most common tactics to emerge, by the way, was to whiff a heavy and then just immediately press another button, sometimes even another heavy, to catch a missed punish attempt. Capcom saw this problem and chipped away at it by expanding hurt boxes a few times so that moves could be more easily punished, scaling down crush counter damage, and reducing the input lag from nearly 8 frames to around 5. This all took more than 2.5 years though, and that was more than enough time for players to leave and never look back. Oh, and I haven't even mentioned the myriad of other problems Street Fighter V faced on both the gameplay and communication fronts. But at least now we could finally play a Street Fighter that fulfilled traditional footsie expectations. Except we couldn't. V-triggers were Street Fighter V's comeback mechanic, and though they're a concept that we could see working if implemented well, they wound up being way too impactful. These overly powerful moves upset the risk-reward balance of entire rounds of play. V-triggers were each character's hardest hitting special maneuvers, meant to ensure fireworks would fly near the ends of rounds. You could build your V-trigger by successfully using your V-skill, but by far the most common way of getting to trigger was simply by being hit. Take enough damage and you'd be rewarded with a V-trigger, and in many cases, the impact V-triggers had on rounds were far greater than anything else. You could spend a good 40 seconds systematically picking your foe apart through smart plays and strong execution, only to give them a nuclear bomb-like attack that could turn the tables in an instant and empty life bars from most any percentage. The best characters in the game were often those with the best V-triggers, and again, what was expected to be a nuanced and multifaceted duel devolved into what felt more like a race to a single goal: get V-trigger and win. At this point, it almost felt like first halves of many rounds were meaningless, and successfully outsmarting your foe and hitting them wasn't satisfying because the reward of V-trigger was more valuable than the reward of taking out the first half of a life bar. It's not to say that every round went this way, but it happened enough to be a real problem. Listening to their fans, Capcom would go on to eventually nerf V-triggers by scaling damage and giving players another way to use their V-meter, this time in a defensive fashion, with V-shift, all in early 2021. Finally, our footsies were fixed and V-triggers were toned down enough that they weren't the only relevant factor in a match. We could play Street Fighter again. Except we still couldn't. SF5 had come a considerable way from what we were playing in 2016. Capcom tweaked footsies, they tweaked V-triggers, and yet there was still a problem with footsies and V-triggers, namely where they met. You see, we've talked about how strong V-triggers were when they were in use, but there's another crucial component to their power: their activation. When you activate your V-trigger, the screen freezes and your character proceeds into either the attack or status buff their trigger grants them. Thing is, you can actually use your V-trigger activation to cancel out of the ending animations of most of your attacks, including ones that normally carry a hefty amount of risk. Here's an example. Take G's EX Smash Under attack, a fast, forward advancing and low hitting move that can easily catch foes off guard. Lots of obvious rewards, so the balance on the risk side of the scale is the fact that this move is very punishable at -8 when blocked. Cancel its recovery frames into V-trigger, however, and it becomes not only safe, but massively advantageous at +4. This risky racing and reward buffing logic applies to those crush counter heavies we talked about earlier, as well as to a myriad of other special moves, and remember, even if you successfully defend the initial interaction, you still have a freshly V-triggered foe up in your face to deal with, and they got there almost for free. As such, once V-trigger is stalked, the game changes, as trying to play footsies against an opponent who can mitigate almost all risk is often a losing strategy. This is still fully in the game and something every player has to deal with in virtually every round. It ultimately takes us a good ways away from the kind of footsie-based back and forth that was so beloved in Third Strike, and for a lot of people, I think this creates a subtle but constant rub that etches away their sense of fun while playing. Developers have done a lot to turn Street Fighter V into more of the game their fans want, and though we've spent a lot of time here highlighting one of its biggest shortcomings, it very much does lend itself to interesting interactions where skill and thoughtfulness are significant factors in the outcome. This all adds up to a reasonably fun experience, and I think that's reflected by the general success of the aforementioned Capcom Cup 9, as well as the decent amount of fans who are still playing it up until the very end. But asking the player base to continually endure the grating frustrations the game used to and still does have to an extent proved too much for many people who were hoping and expecting for something more. Even with all the mentioned alterations, we're still playing a toned-down version of the initial product in many ways, and the late addition of Luke as an obviously overpowered top tier was quite a big turnoff after a series of smart decisions and smart moves in the right direction. Street Fighter V was a roller coaster that managed to keep the franchise's head above water, even if it got a nose full at times, and is finishing out with neither really a bang nor a whimper. A very silver lining to all these hard lessons is that it appears as though Capcom learned most all of them, and is setting up for an experience in Street Fighter VI that very well may take the entire franchise to new heights. I've been John Velociraptor Guerrero for EventHubs. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next Street Fighter.